Good morning and welcome to the July 10th, 2024 mid-month for the Douglas County Planning Commission. At this point, I will turn it over to Becky.
Thank you. All right, so before we begin, I just want to go over our usual hybrid rules for the meeting. My name is Becky Pepper, and I'll be helping to facilitate this Zoom video portion of the meeting, and I'll work alongside the vice chair to facilitate the meeting proceedings. If you have any, the meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and cable channel 25. Please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you're not speaking. Unless you're participating during the meeting, please turn your video off. This allows the active meeting participants to be seen on the screen. You'll still be able to hear the meeting. When you are participating, please turn your video off. If you have any trouble, you can send a chat to me. The city reserves the right to mute people or turn individual videos off to minimize distractions during the meeting. Okay, and then so the next item on the agenda was I wanted to cover something on CIP. Is it okay if I just roll into that?
Please
okay.
do.
Thank you. And I'm going to try and share my screen here. Oops. Okay, so I just wanted to spend a really brief, about few minutes on an update or an overview on our capital improvements plan, because that's going to be on your agenda this month at your Monday meeting. And so I wanted to let you know where some materials are available if you are interested in looking at the CIP in more detail. Just kind of as a reminder, the CIP, the capital improvements list, is dictated by state statute, and as part of that state statute, it requires that it comes through the Planning Commission for review. And your purview, as you're looking at that, is to see if the projects that are listed on our capital improvements list align with the goals and policies of our comprehensive plan, of Plan 2040. So on our agenda for this meeting, we added a couple links to help you find these materials in the future. So these are the two most recent, most recent City Commission meetings that these items have been at on June 18th. So that link's going to send you here. And what I wanted to point out here is if you scroll to the bottom of this agenda item report, if you go, you'll find these attachments, and the project sheets link is where you're going to find more detailed information on all of the projects that are on the list, if you are so inclined to really dig in. The other link on the agenda is for our meeting that just occurred last night. And so here are some more attachments, including the more updated CIP project list. This one is just the list of projects, though. It's not that project detail sheet. So that's why I wanted to have both of those meetings for you. So here's where the July meetings, we're going to find the more updated CIP list. If you want to dig in and see what those details are on the projects, you'll go to the June meeting for that one. So again, this is on your agenda for for July, but just wanted to give you this material so you could prepare in advance if you were so inclined to do that.
Becky, could you or Jeff say again what the Planning Commission's role is in CIP approval?
Right. And Jeff, if you want to add more details, but really your role is to look at that kind of overarching, do the projects that are on the list align with the goals and policies of our comprehensive plan? So that includes our growth policies, environmental policies, all the chapters within our comprehensive plan.
So we're not making a land use decision,
Right.
we're not testing against any approval criteria, we're just saying, does this meet our comprehensive plan? If yes, then it does.
Gary, if your microphone's on, I can't hear you.
I'm sorry, Mike, I was stepping back away from it.
That's better. That's better.
Yeah, I was just asking for clarification on what the Planning Commission's role is in that, and what Becky had said was, I guess you heard what Becky said. She was doing it right. We're not looking at land use. We're not looking at a checklist of criteria. We're just, the one thing we're asked to do is to say, does this conform with comprehensive plan? If yes, then go. If not, then raise that question.
Correct. It's a real high-level look because a lot of these things don't have a lot of detail yet. They're still in the development phase, and just also it's not about looking at the money. That is a city commission prerogative. So it's just really about if these do get funded, would they be in conformance?
And is it also true that your staff has worked alongside city staff in development of that? Sure.
Yeah, Amy Miller and Becky have been in the throes of this since the very beginning, and we've had a lot of other staff come and go as part of that one. So planning has been engaged from the very beginning when this was starting to be developed last year.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Becky. We'll turn to the next item on the agenda, which is a update on our land development code from Clarion. We have our consultants in the room today with us. You guys want to introduce yourselves, and then I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Garvin with Clarion Associates, and I'm here with my colleague, Gabby Hart. I have not been hauling her up at 6:30 in the morning to meet with you guys, but we're here, so nice to see you in person. Becky, I got it going, so let me go ahead and share screen. We have a fairly short presentation this morning. You all may know that over the past 2 days, we've done a whole set of neighborhood meetings coming up. There we go, and let's do share screen, do presentation. Come on. There we go. And so we've got some feedback to share with you, and then we wanted to talk about potential schedule going forward. We know that's been a big conversation in the community, and we got some guidance from City Commission on their July 2nd meeting. So let's dive in. Let you know what we've been hearing. So recap the neighborhood meetings, adoption meeting approach and schedule for your discussion and next steps. Just to remind everybody and anyone that might be new with us today, because we signed up some new followers to our YouTube channel over the last couple days. So we might have exceeded 10 at that point. So what we're doing with the Land Development Code project is identifying opportunities to implement city plans, starting with Plan 2040, including a whole range of relevant plans, and making sure that the Land Development Code helps the city make it easy to accomplish the types of development that the community wants to see. We are looking to have the code help create more predictable development outcomes, to simplify and streamline development procedures so development can move relatively quickly through the process, and to make the entire code more user-friendly. So here's our project schedule, and you can see we're at the end. We're kind of teetering on the adoption draft into the final land development code. We will be posting next Friday, a week from Friday, the 19th, the version of the code that we're going to keep posted through the adoption process. So we're trying to make sure it doesn't look like a moving target to everybody. So this version will be done in track changes. So everyone who's looked at the version that's up right now can see the difference. So you don't have to like try to hold them up to the light and compare. And we will still be taking comments on this version. The big difference is those final comments will be sorted by Steering Committee and Planning Commission, not by the consultant team. So we'll feed them back. But it will be your choices to decide where you want to propose going with those. So, next slide.
If I understood what you just said, what will come back, where there's a question, you're going to articulate that so that planning and steering can quickly go to the thing and say, yes, I want it to be A or B.
Correct.
Or D.
Yeah, so, yeah. So we'll work to present it to you in a way where you can make a decision about what's going on in the code.
And is that what's going to come back to planning in our next set of meetings after the 19th?
So that's something that we want to talk about because we wanted to try to make it easy for the community to understand where Planning Commission is and where Steering Committee is. So let's get into the schedule in just about 4 slides, if that's okay.
All right.
Cool. You're almost always a step ahead of me, but okay. So meetings yesterday, and the day before. And we have more meetings next week because not everybody was able to make it in person according to the schedule we had, so we'll do virtual meetings next week. So this is, it's a summary overview, just to let you know. So we sent invitations out to the neighborhoods through the city email list. We scheduled meetings for 30 minutes. We didn't do a presentation, we just asked people to bring their comments. So far, we've done neighborhood meetings with Oriad, Alvamar, Pinckney, Barker, East Lawrence, an individual from Clinton and Castle, Save the Wakarusa River Valley, Land, Old West Lawrence, Brook Creek, and University Place. Then we have the 5 virtual meetings scheduled for next week, so that's Sunset Hill, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, 4 congregations in that group, Hillcrest, Springwood Heights, and Sunflower. We are also going to find some time just to schedule an open house drop-in virtually. So if someone's unaffiliated, like the lady that we had that lived by Clinton and Castle, or if there are neighborhoods that have more information they want to share. So we're going to come up with time to do that. And so we listened, and everybody came prepared with questions and comments. It went really well. And not surprisingly, because we were focused on neighborhoods, the comments sorted themselves into some really overlapping or repetitive groups. So first and foremost, there were concerns about eliminating residential parking. And I want to say, like, our first 3 points all read together. They're all interrelated. And so the concern about eliminating residential parking minimums, it's strictly residential parking minimums. I think we talked about commercial parking minimums, but the concerns were only residential. We did not have anyone come in and say, I'm so worried that Walmart's going to get rid of parking and it's never going to work the same. It was only residential. So as these read together, if we eliminate residential parking minimums and we increase the number of unrelated individuals who can live together, and we allow duplex, conversion, we allow duplex development in most residential neighborhoods, because you guys may remember we allowed duplex in R1 and R2. So places where we have single unit development now can have duplexes. So that is, to many of the neighborhoods, the perfect storm of student housing. So people will come in, they will buy and scrape existing single units, they will replace them with 5-bedroom duplexes. We'll have 10 people total in each duplex combo, and they'll each have a car. I think that kind of just summarizes the worst case scenario that most people are envisioning. So I think if we go back to the first slide, there is, I think, more of a belief that the parking minimums, the residential parking minimums, are kind of the choke point for that development right now. There's some belief that the unrelated occupant minimum, which is 3 for R2?
It is 3 for property zoned RS and 4 for property zoned RM.
Thank you. So this was a concern. The occupancy was a concern, but we did have a smattering of comments that, people believed in many places that the students outstripped the occupancy max anyhow, and that wasn't an enforcement priority for the city at this point. So reading together, I think I would come away with it saying that it wasn't as much pushback on the duplex development. That most neighborhoods said, no, we have duplexes and they're fine. What we're worried about is an increased number of students and increased number of cars. So I think, would you say you heard it that way also, Becky and Gabby?
Was the worry the students more or the cars more?
It's the students and their cars. They are inseparable. So, and we did, just thinking along those lines and sharing with the group, a couple times we said there are good reasons to increase occupancy limits, especially occupancy limits that are based on family relationships, because when those kind of limits were put into place in the 40s and 50s, we just you know, as a community saw family in a certain way, and we see family in a variety of ways now. And so there are probably good reasons to lift that requirement. And, you know, we got acceptance on that idea. It wasn't about the related or unrelated. It was about the absolute numbers that the city may end up seeing in development, particularly adjacent to campus, but also in some of the neighborhoods where they believed that developers or alumni would want to buy homes for their kids or want to do redevelopment. So that was kind of the big set of concerns that we heard out of just about every meeting, except a few meetings that were specialized on some other topics. So we heard that there's a concern that increased density will be concentrated in certain neighborhoods, that's related to the current cost of housing in those neighborhoods would make them a target for redevelopment and or gentrification. There was an interesting discussion. There was a through line on if the city wants to see additional density, why is single family R1 still in the code? And so we had that balancing conversation of if in future development the city wants to see more density, wouldn't it be beneficial to say there's going to be no more single family detached going on in the city? And so that bumped up in about, I don't know, 4 or 5 conversations out of the total. So that is more looking forward. You know, the code, and I'm going to say this not for your benefit, but for others' benefit, the code doesn't require anyone to remove their single family home. It gets to stay in place. It is completely fine. So this is definitely, as we develop out further, how do we encourage density if we think everyone will keep doing the developments that are the same as the city sees now?
I think that's easy. I understand what you're saying, and it can help diffuse a little bit of anxiety to say that, you know, if you have a single-family home now, you're going to stay in a single-family home now.
Yeah.
And that it's all really about new development as we go out, except for redevelopment.
Yeah.
And that can change then the character of a neighborhood, particularly if you're not allowed to rebuild something that was characteristic of that neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's a group of folks that are pretty anxious about that as well.
I think that's a fair discussion, particularly in the R2 districts, which have the minimum density requirement. And part of the discussion internally with staff has been clarifying that if you have a lot in R2 that's a 5,000 square foot lot or less, you're not going to be required to put 4 units on it. So that we understand that we need to, before Planning Commission gets back to this discussion in detail, provide some visuals to people about the fact that this code also isn't going to require apartments everywhere. What does it look like in a neighborhood when you're going to make some of these changes?
RS7 and R5 transitioning to R2 is going to represent about roughly half of all of the existing zoning in town. So it would be interesting to go into the math of what the minimums and maximums are. If I could click into that for just, since I've already interrupted you, just one click.
Right ahead.
You know, at 560 square feet per acre, I see in the proposed code 4 minimum, so you're going to be at about 11,000 and change.
Yep.
The maximum, though, I see is 6 units per acre, right?
That's correct.
So you're not, with a 5,000 square foot lot size, you're not going to get 6 in that.
No.
You're not going to put the 8 that might be allowed, the 2,500 foot, you're not going to get 17 or 21 of the 2,000, right?
That's correct.
That buffers some of that density as well in that zoning category.
Yes, and we had the opportunity to drill down into some of that with our participants yesterday, and realized that, as we have people getting into the code who don't normally spend time with it like you guys do, what we think is super user-friendly in terms of a table is still rather an abstract idea. And so we'll be putting together some additional information to help people make sense of that as we go through the next few months of this process. because we realize that people think that their streets are going to be completely parked up and everything's going to be apartments. And that's not how the code checks out, but it's not as accessible to a non-user, so we'll provide examples of that. Thanks for pointing that out.
And just for clarification, so what you basically mean by that is like, even though the code will allow it, when we look at how much land we have and all the other requirements that are going on, it won't be developed or cannot be developed into 6 versus the 4, right? Because of
That's
the way that
correct.
everything is working together,
Correct.
even though the line says you can have up to 6, when you put the actual data in, this particular plot is too small for 6.
That's correct. If you think about it like a funnel, right? It starts with like the biggest idea. You could do 6, and then you have to go down to, but your lot size won't allow it, but the maximum lot coverage is making it even smaller. And guess what? You still have to do setbacks. So we chip away at pieces of the lot, and we get down to, what was theoretically 6 is 1.
Yeah, and I think that is really, especially if you're going to do tables, I think that's really, really important for the public, because I know I'm still wrapping my head around it. It's like I'm reading this, and this sounds like a bad idea. But then when I read this in conjunction with all the other things that the code is doing, I'm like, oh, it doesn't play out as disastrous as I had going on in my head.
Correct.
So I think that's really
Yeah,
helpful.
I think that where you guys are is how we worked through many of the meetings in the last few days, and realize that we could go further to allay people's concerns.
That's awesome.
So we will do that. Okay, so are we good? Should I go ahead and carry on? Okay.
And if we have questions about these, do we need to raise them now, or are we finishing the
back.
presentation? Okay,
Yep.
just double checking.
Thank you. So let me see. So the R1, there's concern about younger generations getting priced out of the market, and opening up opportunities for adaptive reuse. This came up in conversation, and so the conversation we had was adaptive reuse from commercial to residential. So we're seeing this in larger cities where they have older office buildings with footprints that are amenable to being converted from commercial to residential. But we're also seeing it in communities where they take an aging or dying strip mall and put residential on the second floor and community uses or food service or something on the first floor. So in our conversation, we, just in broad strokes, we think the code allows it, but we're going to go back in and make sure the code clearly allows it. And so someone could come through and do that. It was not something that's come up in conversation. We're not entirely sure that the market's going to support it in Lawrence, but why not allow it in the code? Because that aligns with Plan 2040. We did hear some feedback from residents about a desire to incentivize homeownership. The code is pretty neutral about homeownership. How the money comes in for ownership or for rental is outside of the purview of the code. It's something that is more driven by the developer's funding, or the market. I think Lawrence is 55% rental right now.
56, 57, trending upwards.
In the desire to incentivize home ownership, where the code can go and has gone is opportunities to do smaller lot residential development. There is quite a bit of that in there. And so that it just in stepwise how that works is generally speaking, a smaller lot with a smaller home on it is less expensive because it didn't have the land price and the materials going into it that raised the price of the house on the market. And so the code does contain special standards for small lot development. It contains standards for what we call residential courtyard development, so that could be very small lot development. And then we've adjusted the zoning district so you can develop on smaller lots. To the extent that homeownership is a goal in the community, and I think particularly in Lawrence, it is probably a mix because we're all in different places in our lives. But it can be accomplished through these regulations.
Isn't rental up nationwide? I mean, trends-wise, you said it 55 to 60%, and then trending upwards, and that's not just to Lawrence, right? I mean, there are many people making a decision not to enter into homeownership throughout the country, not just here, like we're doing something to create that increase.
Yeah, and I can't couldn't give you the broad parameters. I know it's different in different portions of the country, but it's not a trend. It's unique to us.
It is, it's definitely something that we're seeing on the East Coast in communities that have become quite expensive through the Kansas City area and into Lawrence and then through the West. So it does tend to trend with housing prices.
Okay.
But also, I think that there is a sort of generational switch to, don't need to be locked into this, don't want to do the yard every weekend,
Right.
got other stuff.
I just want to be careful that we're not trying to incentivize something that people are choosing not to participate in.
Correct.
Which I think that point is exactly why it's not a part of the code.
Yeah.
Right, you're right. I mean, that makes sense.
There's so many other things.
Okay, so what did we hear about commercial development? Not a ton. We have heard from staff and from steering committee to make sure that the city can allow quite a bit of mixed-use development. The concern that has come out of the neighborhoods, particularly neighborhoods around downtown, which doesn't have a parking requirement, is allowing an increase of commercial or mixed use and eliminating parking will push parking off into the neighborhoods. So it is not that anyone is opposed to mixed use, it is again a parking concern. And then there is some concern about scale and mass of redevelopment. I think we heard this a little bit generally, and then we heard it very specifically from a neighborhood that had seen some commercial go in, and it hadn't felt as sensitive to the neighborhood as it could be. So we walked through the regulations to identify, what regulations apply when someone's doing a larger development. So again, it was one of those cases of, we have this concern and then this stuff in the code, how do we read it? So we did a great deal of how do we read it with everybody. And we did have Save the Wakarusa group come in, and they had some specific requests. I think, was it City Commission that I heard from them a week ago? You guys have probably heard from them.
We've heard some.
So they want to change the floodplain regulations to prohibit residential and commercial development in the special flood hazard area. They want to require a public hearing or a public process for a floodplain permit issuance. It's currently administrative. And they had concerns about how stormwater, stream buffer, floodplain, and drainage impacts are reviewed during the development process.
Sorry, can I chime in? And
Yeah.
the third bullet there was shared among more groups than just that group.
Yep.
I think generally, especially those neighborhoods that are near waterways or creeks, that came up a few times of just drainage concerns, stormwater management. But I just want to make sure that that was a wider point.
Yeah, thank you. So that is what we heard in the floodplain stormwater area. You guys might remember, the code now includes the stream setback requirements, and it has stormwater requirements carried forward. So the two big changes here would be adding a public process for people to understand. It seemed like what we heard from residents is that and I'm being very careful here, that it felt opaque to them. I never know when someone tells me if they don't know something, how far they proceeded into the process. So it could be that, people did proceed into the process and weren't able to get information, or people had an expectation because of the way Lawrence works in land development that the process would come to them and it didn't. And so I'm unsure how it works in there. And then the very specific requests about the flood hazard area, we asked, and the conversation arose from the New Boston Crossing. I just made it old, sorry. Development. That would probably be the one in
Hasn't even been built yet.
Right, exactly. But it linked into a bigger conversation about how development takes place in areas that could possibly flood.
So just to go into that, so you mentioned New Boston Crossings. Is the desire of those making those requests, would that have prevented something like New Boston Crossings because it existed in a floodplain?
So I'm not the expert in floodplain at all, and I'm going to turn that one back to Becky and Jeff, I think.
I can't claim to be the floodplain expert either. But, I think that's probably the conversation the planning commission needs to have, is that difference between a public and an administrative process.
So in the case of, just use this scenario, in the case of that project, New Boston Crossings, are you saying in the new code, those decisions around floodplain would have all, because it was a very, very public.
Yeah, so I'll
You're saying
jump
that
in
would
because
no
I don't
longer be
know.
processed?
I realize there could be behind the scenes stuff going on in a specific application. If we take this more broadly, the request here is to prohibit development in the special flood hazard area. I believe this, the way the city works now is if FEMA approves it, it can happen. So FEMA's the backstop on that.
Yeah.
So the question is, and we haven't had time from yesterday to answer it, could the city choose to go above and beyond what is required in the current floodplain regulations and say there will be no development
Move the
within
line,
the flood
yeah.
hazard area? Is that a policy the city could adopt and then follow through on?
Yeah, this becomes a really important question for Lawrence and Douglas County, given our metropolitan growth area is surrounded in many places by floodplain
Yep.
and have it running through us.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Okay.
You can be a bit floody around here.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
it'd also be interesting to have that question answered, like, right, we have something beyond the FEMA as a backstop, but also just heard a lot, and I don't know anything in this area, and I haven't sat down and talked to a lot of people, but we've been hearing a lot of public comment about the floodplain and about FEMA and about how perhaps their approval or whatever can be inconsistent with some of the other suggestions that FEMA itself is making for good development, because maybe they're not as updated as some of their research, or because they have certain things in place right now that they think are great, but they're continuing to investigate this and the effects of floodplain development.
Contagious this morning, yeah.
Yeah.
The
And so I just would be curious if we could get information kind of about that, or address some of the questions I've seen in the public. There haven't been questions. The information that has been provided in public comment about some inconsistencies there. Just making sure that we're not relying on or adopting or and using as a backstop something that perhaps is changing or something that is good, but continuing to also improve,
Right, moving
if that
from
makes
the way
sense.
We've always done it to a different way.
Yeah, and I don't know enough about FEMA to know why some things would suggest something different maybe than what their approval process or whatever, but we certainly hear that in public comment.
In public comment. So
So-
what we can do here, so we have one other constraint on this, in that in Kansas, flood hazard regulations are approved by the state. And that has to do with how the city does the insurance requirements. So we will add this in to the question process and send it up as a potential policy choice, knowing that if the flood regulations are updated, it won't happen in this round of the land development code. It would need to happen in its own course, in its own calendaring course. But we will go back and speak with city staff members who are the ones that kind of shepherd that through.
Thank you.
Okay?
And it's not uncommon, the floodplain regulations get updated by the state at different intervals, and so then we have to do a large update. I think the last time we did it was 18 or 19, because the state did some significant changes. So it's not uncommon that you have a code and it'll evolve as the state and the feds evolve around the process.
And is that a ceiling or a floor, I guess? So the regulations, is it like, the state regulations are like, it must at least
That's our
do
question.
this? Or is it that you cannot require anything beyond this? We don't
At
know.
this point, we're right where you are.
Great.
What's possible? And so we'll take that question forward.
And I guess I'd love to understand the difference between building an existing floodplain and what's required there, and as a separate question, what the process is if we're going to change the floodplain. To me, those are two separate.
Can you clarify, change the floodplain?
I think to Commissioner Rexroth's question on that one, the city can't change the floodplain.
Right, FEMA.
It's only the federal government can change the floodplain, and they have a very prescriptive process of
Right.
what it is there. So the question that we would have to research is can we have a standard in exceeding that requirement? And we don't know the answer to that one, because in our other limitations that are in place at different levels of government that we'd have to do and explore on.
What I'm trying to do is introduce the idea that there's a spectrum.
Yep.
It's not all the same thing, that there's
Right.
something out there that might be, for some whatever reason, buildable through an administrative process in town, but it's a different thing to create a different area by changing the floodplain. And New Boston Crossing's a big part of that, and understandably controversial, was that they were going to change the floodplain map. So they had an application to FEMA that said if we move enough dirt in these
Right.
places, we'll actually change the floodplain.
Right.
Which has impacts beyond just where we're building here.
Right.
Downstream and literally downstream impacts.
Right. And that had to go through FEMA.
Right. What I'm suggesting is that perhaps it's not just that
Yeah.
all floodplain questions are the same. There may be some that absolutely warrant
Right.
a larger public process and inspection, and maybe there's some category of that is less so.
Yep, that tracks.
I'm just asking that question.
Yeah, and that's a great reminder. That's kind of what I was talking about. So I remember when we were having that conversation, and FEMA gives it the go-ahead, yes, you can go ahead and do this. Is that the answer, or is it we can actually require more or say no? Even though FEMA's saying yes, when we look downstream, we don't want to be that community that's creating these other things.
Yep. So we got a multi-part question going here.
Awesome, thank you. Does anybody online have questions about floodplain? I know we're kind of all over, but since we've dived so deep into this one, I want to make sure anybody online that wanted to ask about, we can always come back to it, but do any of you have any questions for this discussion we're having now? All right, thank you.
All right, so then we heard a few specific things in procedures. So consider increasing the appeal period for an administrative decision from 9 days to 14 days. So that is a decision made in the code by a city staff member or a department head or something. When can it be appealed to the Board of Zoning Appeals? Right now, you have 9 days to appeal it. Our conversation was that's a pretty quick turnaround. Could that go to 14 days? In the by right development process, we did spend a lot of time on the back and forth of the idea that someone could build something on their property without notice going to the neighbors. And so just to ground everybody, right now, if I have a vacant lot, I can put a house on it and notice doesn't go to anybody. I get my building permit and it goes. So in the code as it's drafted now, that would be the process for a single unit detached or a duplex. Once you get up to a triplex, you're in site plan review and notice is triggered at that point in time. It can still be approved administratively. And this is a place where we find it's really nice to give notice and it's super frustrating to give notice. People can come in and comment on it, but as long as the application meets the code, it will get approved. So even if someone came in and said, I think it needs more parking, as long as it meets the minimum parking requirements, which, it's none right now, but even if we had 4 in there, if it met 4 and someone wanted 6, that doesn't mean the city's gonna add 2. So it's a challenging place. So we actually heard mixed comments within the groups. So I won't say that there's a consensus on this, but it does come up. We want to know what the neighbors are doing, which is just common human behavior. We always want to know what the neighbors are doing. The question for Lawrence is that beneficial to the process to bring more people in? One of the things we talked about really early on is, why does it take so long to get something approved in Lawrence? Part of it is because everyone can weigh in on everything. And so, in doing this code, we tried to find a balance of there are enough standards in the regulations for someone to take an application through and be approved without having a lot of meetings on it. That change is making people uncomfortable. I will point out, because we were meeting with the neighborhoods, we did hear the exact opposite comment from the Home Builders Association in the information they sent. They are very much on board with doing less meeting over things that meet the code. So I think you can tell by my comments that I definitely have a position on this, but I don't have a strongly held position on it. We do work in communities where notice of everything is given to everyone, and that's a community preference.
Notice is different, though, than public hearing.
It is different. It's, you're just given mailed notice.
So it really is a burden on the developer or
It would be.
that entity making the change and
Yep.
staff.
Yep,
Because staff is going to have to resource for an increased volume of, hey, I don't like what's happening, and then being able to help explain to them why it doesn't matter.
that's correct. I think the big change, correct me if I'm wrong, is single family can go through right now. Can duplex go through? So no, there's effectively no change. Were you going to say something?
No, current process is exactly the process you see on the slides right there. Anything that goes 3 units and above goes through site planning procedures is what it is. So it's really carrying the process we currently have forward.
Okay.
So really, there's no concern. There shouldn't be
Right.
concern.
No, but we're changing the regulations, and
Yeah, right,
so
so people
people are
assume-
looking at everything, thinking what's going to happen
Crack it
here.
open, it is the opportunity.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, the regulations, the procedural regulations aren't changing. Some of the land uses that are permitted by right now are changing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Right.
And then, this was a specific request out of one meeting, that neighbors should receive notice when waivers have been granted to development. So it links back to concerns about parking waivers being granted in areas where putting parking on the street could potentially cause traffic problems. Lots of people are worried that the streets are too parked up as it is. And so if someone gets a parking waiver, under the new code as drafted, they wouldn't get a parking waiver. But if someone gets a waiver, that information should be shared with neighbors also. So there's some alignment on, we want to know what change is happening in our area. I think it's less common overall to notice up that type of information. If a decision is made within the reasonable discretion, within the rules that the city is guided by, they usually don't give notice of that. So then moving on, whoops, that's it. So that's it on the comments. Do you guys want to talk about anything else?
Yeah, I do think it'd be really helpful. So it's 8:15, and I don't know how we want to spend the rest of today. I'm happy to hear the rest, and it looks like we're going to go into schedule, but I think there are probably some people that have questions about some of the stuff you talked about, particularly in the beginning when we weren't asking questions. So I just want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to do that. Would you guys like to jump directly into scheduling, or do you want to start being able to ask some of the substantive questions about what we just heard?
I have some questions.
Okay, yeah, let's do that if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I might add too, I think part of the scheduling discussion too will be about what topics you want to hear on what things too. So keep that in mind too. There'll be much more opportunities to dig in there and ask more questions.
Great.
Please ask your questions now too, by the way.
Great.
Yeah, so the question is on parking. A lot of people that have reached out are genuinely like up in arms about it. They're like, you're increasing density. What is that going to do? So how do we allay their fears? Like, what are
So we were talking about this a little bit yesterday. We think that it will probably be beneficial for us to go back to some of the communities that have put a no parking rule in place over enough time to have seen some development, and talk to their staff and find out if worst case scenario has actually happened. We do know that there have been a handful of college towns that have done that over the years, and so we think those would probably be the best examples, like Fayetteville. So we're going to go reach out and figure out, would they do it differently, or is it working the way that they thought it would? So looking for some empirical
Okay.
evidence.
I'd also, just if I could.
Yeah, please,
add on to
please.
that.
Yeah.
Just some beyond the binary, is it working? Would you do it different? Did they learn something that they could do incrementally?
Correct.
Like, that's what I find myself wondering. Does it have to be
All or nothing.
binary?
Yes.
Or-
Yeah, and then are there shades, or, are there steps that the city can take?
As
And
a-
that's part
as
of what we heard.
a great example, I think we took that note, and said, hey, if you're going to change a garage
Yep.
into a living unit, you have to maintain a parking spot. I think that's a great example of thinking about the impact of parking and taking a subtle step, maybe even a big step towards relieving some of it.
Yeah, correct. Along those lines, we do know that some of the communities that eliminated parking minimums kept a residential parking minimum, so we thought we would talk to them also to see what that kind of middle place looks like.
Gotcha. Thanks for letting me jump in.
Other questions about parking? Anyone online? I had a question about, since we're talking about the parking and all the three that kind of work together, the changing or having the increase to 5 unrelated.
Yeah.
Did the steering committee look at kind of what has happened since we implemented that change? Like, I don't know if it was in the 90s, or we made some rules about how many unrelated people could live to. I happened to be in college at the time, and it was quite an uproar because who are you going to live with now, kind of a thing. Yep. And so we've been doing and having some rules around it for a while. Have we looked at like what the change was, or if whatever the goals were of that particular change, did it execute them, and are we in a position to want to go back?
An interesting question. I didn't realize that the city had already made one step incrementally.
Well, now, I was in college, so take that for what it's worth. Find out for what the time was. I just remember a discussion about that.
We could do a little digging on that and see if it has, had the negative consequences. We brought this to the code based on what we're seeing in other communities that are trying to provide housing.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that gets in the way is that family requirement.
Yeah.
And so.
And I'm not like, I love what you said about the idea of family has changed now. And so just the definition itself might not be appropriate. I just know that when somebody does something, it's always good to look back and to think about why did we do that before we tear down that fence?
Yeah.
So I was just curious.
Yes, we can do that and share that out with everybody.
And again, I could be wrong. Perhaps it never actually happened and I dreamed it all.
No.
I was in college.
Definitely. It definitely happened, and I have friends
You
who
were in
are
college too.
yeah, and I have friends who are own rental properties across town, and several of them have voiced concerns about this raise because of how it affects what their requirements are for renters. And allowing them to have more density inside is great, right? We need to fill up the spaces we have. Their concern is also just property management, as you will.
Yeah, there's two questions for me. One is the impact of density in an area, and the other is the nature of how families have changed. We've got this kind of undercurrent of saying we're going to use this traditional description of family value and trying to apply it in code. And I'm not sure that's an appropriate place for that.
So it may be just based on what you all are talking about, that even if there isn't a change up to 5, getting rid of, just going to a number of occupants and taking out the familial piece of it altogether might be.
That gets at it, right? Because you can have 12 related people in a house that really shouldn't.
That's really what's so inequitable about that. If I wanted to have 14 kids, we could all live together. I would be in my room hiding, but yeah.
Yeah, that was kind of my, like, why did we do that a long time ago? Because I think it just simply had to do with college students. And it was more along, like, what we have uniquely here, not trying to regulate familial relationships.
Okay. So we can do a 2-part change on that and talk about then still what the roll-off is.
There is a sidebar component to this that is in the long-term and short-term rental licensing program. The code statute is no more than 3 unrelated or 4 unrelated, and the definition of unrelated is those that are not, and I'm going to butcher this off the top of my head, but not related by blood, marriage, adoption, or other legal bounding means, or something to that degree. So there is that other element that it would be outside of the land development code, but it'd be in the rental licensing program. So just keep that in mind, is that there's other parallel codes that are running right next to this that may still have to be altered as part of the process.
You want to be able to provide for families to live together.
Right.
Whether they choose to legally, connect or not. Yeah.
And I also don't want to punish a family that might have different last names or a different kind of relationship that.
But I do absolutely understand the college student rental.
It's a balance.
Situation.
It's a balance.
They could feel like a family, though.
Yes.
Who knows?
Thank you. Anybody else have questions?
If I may, I have a question about that because certainly in our neighborhood, we have had at least one house where there have been 6 or 7 students. And whenever we inquire about enforcement, there just isn't time to get it done. And all I can tell you is that we've got 6 cars parked on a regular basis on the street as well as in the driveway. And I don't know what the status of current enforcement of any regulation is, and if that status would change in any way with a change in the code.
That's a fair question.
So my guess, being the non-city staff member, let me make a guess, is that in Lawrence, like pretty much everywhere, enforcement staff probably has very full plates. So if the city wants to prioritize occupancy as an enforcement item, that may require reprioritizing some of the other life safety issues that code enforcement deals with, and/or adding staff. That's usually how that works. You're nodding.
That's exactly how it would be at this point in time. Right now, it's, the processes of going through one of those, we're complaint driven. We receive a complaint, we act on it, but there's other complaints where if a roof is falling in or there's a life safety issue, those clearly take a little bit more priority because they might be immediate life danger issues, and we investigate those first as we move through. Currently in the city's proposed budget at this point in time is adding 1 code enforcement officer, and we're getting way outside the bounds of the land development code at this point in time. But that's the team that goes and explores those kind of items as they come up. And I will tell you from having worked on those is when you get a question of is a structure meeting the occupancy standards, it's not an immediate thing. It requires days and weeks of research and investigation to even get to that point. And so it takes a very long time to get to those. So they are by nature intensive and time-consuming processes to get to that point. So it's not a walk out, the smoke detector, here's the thing. It takes a lot of work to even figure out, is there an over-occupancy issue, or are they related and they meet the definition, and then that has to be done too. So those can be a bit of a thing, but again, that's pretty well outside the land development code process. That's more of an operations side for code compliance.
Right.
Other questions on this topic? Commissioner Eldridge, did that answer your question, or did you have more?
No, that answers my question on that topic. Thank you.
Great.
Did you, Elizabeth, did you get any feedback on, we want to make the city more walkable, encourage biking and stuff like that. Did you get any feedback on, is the city a place where it is, do we have to do more to make it walkable? I mean, how do residents feel about the walkability of Lawrence? Or was there
No, we
anything?
didn't get any specific feedback about that. We have, when we get into your schedule, we flagged that for a specific discussion,
Yeah.
I think at one of your August meetings, because that is something that clearly comes out of Plan 2040 and some of the other transportation planning. So we did hear just kind of a one-off comment on that it was a bad experiment in the 60s when the city let developers skip putting in sidewalks because there are places that don't have that level of connectivity now that you would otherwise want to see in the city. And we did hear definitely from neighborhood groups that they enjoy walking and bicycling. But I think everyone was so very focused on the parking. Yeah, that we didn't get to that level of detail. We're hoping by bringing it up as a topic with Planning Commission that will encourage people to weigh in on it as we go through the next few months.
Got it. And then sort of in parallel to that, as we gray as a city, people think driving is something that they have to do. I mean, just, because they, even if 10-minute neighborhoods are designed for shopping is 10 minutes away, so some people just can't do that walk.
It rains sometimes.
Or rain sometimes or whatever. So it's kind of, did that kind of stuff come up?
So what we heard from an individual landlord who was in a couple of our meetings is that he has more tenants now that don't have cars than he's ever had in the past.
Wow.
And they use Lawrence's pretty darn good public transportation system. And so, he's not sure if he's just, seeing particular people who are making that choice, or if it is, more of a priority for, millennials or Generation Z. And I stereotype entirely too much.
Right.
But, it is important. I don't know how much it's just baked in, and people expect it to be something that they are able to do. But in the parking conversation, we did have pushback a few times about, the idea that not every single resident of every single apartment has a car. And, you know, there are people that don't have cars in Lawrence and they get around just fine. So that, you know, kind of came in from the side on some of the conversations. It was there.
Yeah. I guess where I'm trying to go with this is, you know, we're encouraging people to walk, but if the city's not doing enough to make it possible to do that, you know, it's like, are we just making it more dangerous, and, you know, are we going to have more accidents and stuff like that, you know?
Yep.
So are we thinking about both things, you know?
We think we're thinking about both
Yeah.
things in the draft, and we welcome, you know, people digging into that and talking about it. And after this, we can go back and take a look again.
Yeah.
Make sure that we think we've captured everything the city would want to do.
And sorry,
Go ahead.
whose purview is that, Jeff? The, you know, do we have our sidewalk safe, and that's not land development code, right? That's more,
Land development code would require sidewalks to be installed at certain rates. Now, the question about how they're designed and detailed is a question of MSO and the street design standards. So how do the intersections meet? Do they have the ADA spacing and ramp parameters down in place and those kind of things? You know, if you have material that could wash out over the sidewalk, how is that being treated to some degree? Could be land development code, but it's really, sidewalks tend to be in the public right of way and tend to be the purview of the engineers and MSO.
I see. So really, we don't address that
It's just fact that sidewalks are required, and then
yeah.
then the details of what those sidewalks look like and how they're designed are for MSO to kind of be consistent on.
Okay, thank you.
But there is a space in the land development code to get at what you're saying, right? The
Yeah.
idea of we want to be walkable, right? That would come in with the idea that we're requiring sidewalks. Or,
Yeah, so we-
you know, so like,
yeah.
they're not in the nitty gritty of it, but at the higher policy level, I think what you're trying to execute, the land development code is an appropriate place to have that conversation.
Yep.
And then how it gets executed might be to other places. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the walkability and all of that is very much an important topic.
Yeah, so if we take it apart in pieces, new subdivision requires sidewalks. So that's where Jeff was. And the code requires when you do new mixed use or commercial development that you have done sidewalk connections any place people would need to go to keep them out of the way of vehicles. And then you have to connect out. So if there is a pedestrian walkway, or if there are other sidewalks, you have to make those connections to offsite your property also. So I think the way that it's drafted, as development takes place, the city gets those connections and those safe sidewalks and bikeways.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Bike parking, I think, is
bike parking is in it.
also a part of that enables multimodal.
Right, you get people to use the infrastructure if they can safely park their bikes on both ends.
A quick question, I think more process. I'll use parking as the example. Is it your plan I'm just trying to understand what the plan is. You're going to go out to Fayetteville, you're going to get a bunch of other information, you're going to come back with some recommendations on or at least other things to think about in parking.
Yeah.
Is the plan to take that to Steerco and have them form a recommendation that then becomes a part of what the Planning Commission recommends, or?
So I think that's something that we need to talk through, and that could be, so the way I understand it is that because we're doing this extended process with Planning Commission and Steering Committee, we can do the back and forth, or we can say Steering Committee is going to have recommendations, Planning Commission is going to have recommendations. We're not sure, because you're different bodies, if it's going to be the identical recommendations. So if we take it back to something like the parking, what we'll probably do is a short white paper, 3 or 4 paragraphs on what we learned, and then a list of options. And then, so we will definitely share that with Steering Committee. It probably won't make it to the meeting next week. I'm not sure we're gonna have enough time to get there, so it would probably be more like the August meeting. And so if the 2 recommendations align, and I think, and I'm sorry, Commissioner Rexford, I'm trying to make sense of this in my head as we go forward. I don't think we want, at this point, one body to hold up for the other. But to the extent that we all get to the end and then can merge whatever the similar recommendations are, then we'll probably send forward, here's the joint report, here's what steering committee may want to do differently, here's what planning commission may want to do differently, and let city commission
So
make
it might
sense of
end up
that.
with two separate bodies of recommendation going to the city commission. They'll have to rationalize what they want to do.
Yeah, yeah.
That would be interesting procedurally. Sorry, the lawyer in me is coming out. Like, I'll ask questions about that later, but statutorily, it's the planning commission who makes the recommendation. So I just would be curious about that side-by-side recommendation.
So theoretically, what it would be is the recommendation of the planning commission would set the vote threshold for the city commission, but it doesn't mean the steering committee can't send its own recommendation forward. It just doesn't have the ability to change the vote requirements under state statute.
Okay,
It's interesting because it's not just like a disinterested third party or an interested third party out here. It was actually impaneled by the city commission, personed by constituents in certain groups, including the planning commission. So it's not just an interested third party, but do they have a statutory standing? I don't know how that fits.
Well, I don't know if that matters.
Yeah.
One thing I love about this is I'm learning more about city, local government law than I've ever, and so every time something comes up, I'm like, can we do that? Wow,
Living it.
So, yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways it could go around, but I mean, based on, and I would recommend all the planning commissioners take a look and watch the July 2nd city commission meeting because they went very in depth on their expectations and discussion for what this process would be. And that's why you have that schedule that we have on your memo today is part of that is because they recognize that we're going to have potentially a situation where, there isn't 100% agreement between the steering committee and the planning commission. And instead of having it bounce back and forth and take years off, it would be, let's bring it to the governing body, which you work for and the steering committee works for, and let them settle that discussion, which is their power to do. But again, the statutory requirement is that your recommendation would set the vote threshold for what that would look like.
That's a segue into what you're.
It is. So this is what's come out of the last city commission meeting. So you will be living this dream for your next 7 meetings. It will be all about the code. And I've got a more detailed schedule in a slide here. The steering committee will continue to meet each month between July and September. We will put the new draft up on July 19th, and the public can add their comments to that online draft. They will be able to provide public comment at meetings, and we'll be working with staff to gather up and filter it back to you in a way that you can work through and make sense of kind of more in real time. And then the way City Commission envisions it is that the draft moves to City Commission for their workshop in October. Specifically, this is what it looks like a little more visually. And this is where I think Becky or Jeff was a minute ago. We've broken the code out into sections in terms of recommendations of what you might want to tackle at each meeting. We defer to a different organization if you want it, but we think this will also help group public comments and questions because they kind of fall under specific categories. So we'll post the draft on the 19th. And we thought we'd just do warm-up with administration and procedure. We only heard a few public comments about that. It should be a place where we can kind of get our groove going on how we want to do this. Then into mobility and connectivity. I haven't heard a lot about that, but it's kind of foundational to the regulations. So we thought if we did that and then went into residential districts, uses and standards, and probably what's unsaid there is parking. So we probably need to make that more clear. Residential districts, uses and standards include parking. We'll pick up residential as a piece. And then we can talk about, what can you do on your lot and what size does it need to be and how does the parking work with it? So we think that August set of meetings will be our biggest place for the community. We purposefully put it in the middle. If there's overlap, they can run to a September meeting if you want to keep talking about it. We teed up landscaping and environmental again. We've already had one good conversation about that, and we can bring back comments to you from that conversation and see if there's any add-on that we want to do. We have commercial districts, uses, and standards at the end, simply because we're not getting change comments on it. So we want to make sure everyone's comfortable with it, but from what we're hearing, You know, apart from the adaptive reuse and the concerns about parking overlap into neighborhoods, this is looking pretty solid. And then we left September 25th on schedule so we can wrap, we can take additional topics, and we can see where we are at that point. But we hope that this lets you prep so you don't feel like this is going to be a pop quiz where you have to know the whole code to do this conversation. We hope it lets the public, you know, be anticipating what's going to be talked about so they can be here for the stuff they want to be here for. If they're not as worried about, you know, mobility or commercial standards, they don't have to feel like they have to be here. Sometimes when we have a series of meetings, people feel like they're going to miss something. And we wanted to give them topics for that. And we, you know, we put this out there for your consideration.
I have a question. Thank you, and thank you for being so responsive to the community. Like, we keep hearing from the community about the moving target and things like that. So first, I just want to say thank you for being responsive to them.
Yep.
And I do have a question about that in the sense that I know this is kind of not forced upon us, but a decision made by, you know, in response to the public. And I'm just curious, are we at a spot where we're pretty comfortable that it's not, I just feel like you've been making some pretty big changes and some policy level changes still. And so are we at the point where we're ready for like a solid draft? And then when there are these bigger conversations about policy, because I do feel like some of the stuff that comes up is about policy and what we want to look like as a community. Right. So you're going to flag those, and then the steering committee will have conversations about that, I guess, and the planning commission will have conversations about that. We'll hear from the public on that, and then that's where the two recommendations come in. The steering committee will make its recommendation based on what it believes, and the planning commission will make a recommendation based on what it believes, and that is kind of in lieu of us continuing to have a document that, with your help, we're editing as we're going. Am I kind of understanding that right?
So, yes, what we will do moving forward, so we've fixed the document, so people don't worry about that. And we know we're going to make changes to a fixed document. Right. So that's a magic trick that we're going to pull off.
That's what I'm wondering about.
Right. So
it's hard.
If we go back to the beginning of this presentation, we've got a pretty good idea of what our big issues are.
Okay.
And so what we do in this case is we leave the code out there. When we come back into Planning Commission, and so when we jump into that residential, those 2 August meetings about residential, we will have prepared for you all a presentation. We'll send it out in advance, and it will have all the code sections that we're potentially talking about changing. So what's going on in the parking? What's going on with this residential concern about duplex? What's going on with the occupancy stuff? And then we work through with Planning Commission, okay, here's what the language says. It is more line by line editing. So you can tell us generally where you want to see changes. And then we will draft that for you after the meeting and send it back out for you to take a look at. So when we have agreement on what we think the language should be, then we post that in the comments section. And we can possibly go back into the document and add a note saying there are comments on this section and tell people to go over and look at the comments.
And so then how will that work with two entities making suggestions and changes? So will there be a red line from the Planning Commission and a red line from the Steering Commission committee? Like how
I don't
we
think
have
we're going to redline it again. I think that we're going to have to send up a separate report from each body and say, okay, Planning Commission recommends changing section 20-2.03, and these are the changes they recommend. Okay. So it will read more like when you see an ordinance in a staff report, it'll be a little choppy like that.
Okay. I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. I really I appreciate that, and I know you're doing it in response to the public, so thank you. I just got to figure out what that means in my head.
Yep.
So it is 8:40, so we have about 20 minutes left. Let's take a few questions on procedure, and then just maybe throwing out topics that we think are important that we haven't been able to cover, or maybe some we can still cover, so that we kind of know what we want to talk about going forward. It sounded like somebody online had a question.
That was me.
Okay, great.
So while I appreciate this schedule, as far as we are concerned, it gives us plenty of opportunities. The meeting on the August 14th and September 11th don't give the public any opportunities on those 2 meetings. They have their opportunities on our 2 normal meetings, but the public has no opportunities to participate in our mid-month, if that makes sense. And that gives me concern.
Is that something the commission could change for the purpose of those 2 meetings?
Yeah, the commission can always take comment at mid-month. That's done it before in the past. We just can't take a vote or have any binding action.
But it's also more difficult for people that have jobs to get there to the mid-months. Hence my concern, even if we were to say, okay, we'll take public comment, I don't think we'd get nearly the participation that we would.
There can be written public comment with mid-month. We do get that sometimes.
Correct. Correct. You can have public comment in that line there. And I think that's why I would highlight to everybody to go back and watch the July 2nd City Commission meeting, because they had a very thorough discussion about what their expectation was and what they thought the process should be. And I could not encapsulate that conversation very well in the morning. So I would highlight to go back and watch that meeting, because they had a lot of discussion about some details there.
And we're not prohibited
Well,
from talking about those other 2 categories at the other open meetings as well.
Right.
Not prohibited, it's just organized.
No, this
for
is
you
just
for-
organization
for our
suggestion.
consumption.
Yeah. If you guys want to roll them in someplace else, we can do that.
I guess this might just be an impossible task, but I'll think it out loud. If there's any way to categorize or tag public feedback according to the categories that we're going to be going through those to help us get through the long list of things and know where public feedback that has been delivered
Yeah, we
is
can do
relevant
that.
to the topic of the day. Okay.
And then also, when is it envisioned that, assuming all goes as planned, that we would actually have a vote on the whole thing? Is that September 25th, or is that a meeting in October?
I think 25th, yeah.
Yeah.
So then, I mean, based on what we heard at our last regular meeting, we heard from many people that said we'd like 90 days once you release. September 25th is not 90 days from July 19th.
And
89 days, I believe, going into city commission's meeting.
yeah, right around the high 80s on that one. And again, that was a conversation the city commission had, and they said that their expectation is to have a work session on this on October 15th and to take it up for consideration on November 12th. So working backwards from their expectations is how this timeline that we've kind of put on the memo before you is set out. So that's
The 90 then.
that's how they've kind of set their discussion, their timeline on that.
And even though, I mean, it gives the 90, which was asked for, so in response to the public, but it also then breaks things out and not only gives 90 days, but gives lots of time within that, meetings and time within that for the public and the planning commission and the steering, whoever, the 2 recommending bodies, it sounds like, to then work with the public to incorporate. So it's not just 90 days to read it, it's like 89 days or whatever, but to work with it and to work with those bodies and those entities.
Hey, Elizabeth, so once the final draft is posted and let's say the Planning Commission makes a recommendation, you post that as a comment, and who acts on that? Where does that go? I mean, does it wait until November to get incorporated and voted on, or is somebody going to vote on that? Is there an opportunity to say, this is something we want or don't want prior to November, if it's a recommendation from one of the bodies?
So, okay, wait, let me make sure I'm understanding. So let's say, just for purposes of this conversation, that you guys have, you vote on the 25th to recommend approval with amendments that you've been working on the whole time. So that goes into commission packet, goes to them the way it would normally do that.
I see.
Then steering committee will have a separate steering committee report, essentially,
Okay.
with their recommendations in it.
Okay,
And I think that will just go into the packet
Okay.
also.
I see.
And so no cross-voting, if that's what you're asking?
Yeah, I mean, basically, there is no voting. It's just the city commission is going to vote on our, whether they want to see what we're recommending or not.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, the Steerco doesn't review from the final draft onwards what we're saying. It
No.
goes into the city commission's
Yeah. That's it, that all goes to city commission together, and then they have the opportunity to say, you know, we appreciate the way planning commission worked through this, and we're going to take it forward, or we like where steering committee went with this.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions about procedure, the topic that we're on? And then maybe we'll use the last 15 minutes to have a discussion on a couple other substantive topics. So procedure questions?
I have a question, and that has to do with, I appreciate Mike's comments about the August 14th and September 11 meetings. I very much appreciate the fact that Elizabeth has organized them by topic. I think it'll make our work and the public's opportunity to comment much better. However, I do believe that the August 14th and September 11 meetings should be changed to evening meetings at a time when people can come at a standard planning commission time, 6:30. I don't know what those dates should be. I think the staff would have the best knowledge as to what those dates should be, but I strongly believe that we need to provide that opportunity, not only for ourselves, but most importantly for the public. I know we can't make any motions at this meeting, but I'll leave that for staff and hope that we'll have some answer at our next meeting.
Well, I do think that we could probably have a little bit of a discussion about it if anybody wants to weigh in on that, and then staff could look into the possibility of that, Jane, and then you could make a motion at our next meeting if that's what you wanted to do. Would that work? Okay.
That would absolutely work.
I would agree with what Jane is proposing.
Would it Jeff?
If there were a motion, I would be seconding.
Jeff, did you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I think there's two compounding factors of that, is that your bylaws require, I think, a 20-day notice before any meetings could occur, and then it also be, is the room actually available on any other dates? And that's usually the hindrance, is that the room is unavailable on most of the dates. So, you know, I would say it's not impossible, but it would be pretty impractical. Effectively, it may wipe out those two meetings from your schedule if that's the commission's rule on that one. So you'd really go down in meetings. We probably couldn't come up in meetings as part of that. So as part of the process, you can have a discussion and provide some feedback during this portion, and you can receive public comment at your election on that. You just can't take binding action during a mid-month discussion. So it's you know, it's probably a question more of the Planning Commission, is you'd effectively be eliminating two meetings from the City Commission's outlined schedule. And I don't know how the governing body would necessarily feel about you removing two meetings. The compounding fact of this is that we're probably now in a point where we're over our allocated meetings as part of our contractual arrangement. And so anything that starts adjusting that will have financial implications that the City Commission will have to take up and consider as part of that.
I didn't hear Commissioner Eldridge's suggestion that we don't have them, but simply that we have them at a different time. So would it be that you're saying we can't have them at a different time because the meeting room is not available?
Possibly, yes, because we would not have the ability to have the rooms. We don't know the schedules, and we also would have to figure out what that would look like in terms of both getting staff availability to that one, because generally that's a hard bar in some degrees too, but then also making sure that we actually have the ability to get to notice correctly on that, which would be an extraordinary notice procedure that we'd have to follow through on. So there's a lot of procedural hurdles to go. It's not a small thing to get to. It's possible, but it's not a small thing.
Right.
Can we ask that staff investigate to see if the room is available? And if we were to make a motion and pass it at the 24th, July or August 14th is 21 days after that. And you said we have a 20-day obligation. So
I believe it's 20 days. I'd have to look to make sure on that one, but it would also be a question of when it would go to legal publish, which may not be within that time frame since publications typically occur on Sundays. So it would take us a lot of calendar work and a lot of research to see what's possible.
I'm sure it would be a lot of work, and I appreciate your willingness to at least take a look at it. Sometimes there are other meeting rooms available in the county where public meetings have occurred. I do think it's terribly important with something as big as this land development code to provide every opportunity for the public. And I appreciate what we're trying to do here very much. Thank you for doing your best, Jeff.
Commissioner Hayden, but it sounds like at a minimum we take public comment at those two meetings. You know,
I
just
think
we
we have to make a motion, perhaps. I'm
Oh,
not sure how.
so
We
we
will
can-
look. We will look into that.
We'll look into that,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So thank you. If you guys would help me out with that one, we'll figure that out and the process for that. So even if we were to have them at 7:30 in the morning,
Right.
we would take written public comment, and we will look into taking oral public comment
oral-
during
right,
the
right,
meeting.
right.
Okay, great. Thank you for that reminder. Wonderful. I'm assuming that topic is closed, but before we move on, anyone else want to comment on the procedure? And then if not, is there another topic that someone would like to raise? We have 10 minutes, and so I'm not sure if the best use would just be to talk about a topic or to just list some other things, thoughts about anything we may need to have. I guess before I open that up, I should turn to Elizabeth and say, is there anything you need from us in the next 10 minutes?
No, everything you're doing is great for our process. Thank you very much.
Thanks for all you're doing. I know it's a lot of work, and you're getting right down to it. So.
It is, but it's, you guys have come this far. This is the fun part, or the hard part, both.
It's not process, but if there's no so as far as design standards, you know, so let's say we have a neighborhood, there's going to be redevelopment, there's going to be more density. Have you had any feedback on how does the new thing fit in so that, you know, there's no way to tell the difference between the new thing and the old thing, and so the neighborhood's just gonna what's the thinking there? Do we have design standards in our? Okay.
So that exact thing, the new thing fitting in with the old things, are part of the changes that steering committee gave to us last time, and so we have shared that out. We have a list of, like, I think 10 changes that we're making to accommodate just that.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, I don't have the handout with me, but I bet we can get it emailed over to you. Just thinking about, like, the scale of the structures, how do they fit into the neighborhood, the lot sizes. So we are going to put some limitations in, so you can't have like one mega lot in the middle of an area with much smaller lots. We talked about how the buildings have to be oriented to face the street.
Yeah.
One of the icky things that we've seen in Denver is what they call slot homes. So they orient things internally and then they put parking underneath, and it feels like it's a, you know, complete barrier to everything else. And then we had some really basic design standards about designing the street sides of any duplexes so that they kind of work within the same architectural feel, which is, I know that's really squishy. We actually have better regulatory language than that.
see.
But, like, you know, same number of windows and doors roughly as what's going on around it. And then yesterday we talked potentially about a process that if someone wants to build, like, the architecture professor Rockhill.
Yeah,
A glass house, that there's maybe a process to ask for an out from that, but that's when the neighborhood would probably be able to weigh in on it. So
I see.
we wanted to get the basics in, so what goes in fits, and then figure out a way to get something extraordinary taken out of the process so that there's more public conversation.
Thank you.
So I think we got generally good feedback on that over the last few days, yeah.
Good.
I had a question, really more for Commissioner Eldridge. Jane, you have been talking a lot about this adaptive reuse, and it's not a concept that I'm very familiar with. I know it's come up in a few meetings, and I was just curious if the discussion that we had earlier from the bullet points, that kind of the discussion the community was having about that, is the same type of adaptive reuse that you were using, and if that would be in response to some of those issues you've raised in a few meetings.
I don't know anything about the depth of the adaptive reuse that I heard discussion of today. I was concerned about historic preservation and how we reuse some of our historic sites in ways that allow them to continue as important historic sites. And I'll look forward to seeing what's in the new code regarding that, but I haven't seen it yet.
So, and I think let me jump in on that one, because it's two different things, right? So there is
But I wasn't
historic
sure.
adaptive reuse, and then there's just general commercial to residential where historic isn't triggered. So the code has both pieces right now. I think that we have carried forward the existing historic adaptive reuse language. If not, we have added typical historic adaptive reuse language, because that's in there. The place where we're going to go give it a little more look is just the general commercial to residential. But if Commissioner Eldridge is concerned about anything that's in the historic section, we can give that a closer look also.
Okay. It was when we had some conversations about how
Yeah.
it's not in the current code because it was kind of taken out, but that the new code will be adding the historical
It has the
portion. We'll be
yeah.
adding it back in, and I just wanted to kind of make sure because you had specified commercial,
Yeah.
so I wanted to know what
Yeah.
the difference was.
Chapter 22 is staying.
Is staying in
Chapter
place,
22.
yeah.
Do you
I wanna make
anticipate,
that clear.
I think what it is that our, the adaptive reuse that's in our current code does not address, I think it limits what you can do for residential
Okay,
properties.
thank you.
do you anticipate any changes in either of those two sections between now and the draft on the 19th?
You're talking about
no.
chapter 22?
Yeah, I'm just asking in case Jane wants to go look at it now. She's got that, if it's ready.
Yeah,
to
if
go,
Commissioner
she can
Eldridge
start
wants to give us any
reading it.
comments before this Friday, which is the cutoff on this draft, we can expand it beyond residential if that's beneficial. And I'm sorry, I didn't realize that that was the issue. And then I do anticipate that we can get that commercial one updated so it goes into the new version so people can see it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
But if it's staying the same and some of the issues that we've been talking about haven't been able to, it hasn't been able to address those, then I guess I'm a little confused because I've heard that the current code doesn't address the issues that were kind of raised and that we discussed over the last couple months, but that the new code would address those. And so if it's staying the same, then how is it addressing them?
That's what we're going to work through.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they may be changing. So
Okay.
I realize now that there was an issue beyond what we had in there, so I appreciate you bringing that up.
Anybody else have any topics that they want to bring up? At this point, we have only 4 minutes left. So if you have something that you would like to make sure we discuss in the future and you want to get that in front of the consultants today, please do so.
Yes.
I have an ongoing concern about the potential conflict that is mentioned in section 2105D, and that has to do with covenants and zoning. I would love to have some examples of other cities where there has been a change in the zonings that might then generate a conflict with covenants and how those places have worked them out. Because I'm very concerned about that.
I'm not sure that we can go any further than saying the city has its zoning and communities that have covenants are allowed to enforce their covenants. It's kind of two different, legal paths. I'm sure you recognize that. We don't normally say anything more than the city's not responsible for enforcing private covenants. Was there something you've seen somewhere in particular that you had in mind?
No, but I was thinking about a situation where there might be an addition of a duplex, and within the covenants that would have been prohibited. So the only way the other neighbors have of enforcing it is suing a neighbor. And, to me, that's not something we really want to do, set up conflicts that would end up in court. We want to have a compatible neighborhood where people get along and are welcome and don't end up fighting with each other. So I was wondering if you could give me any examples of a place where there had been zoning that was all single family, and then we changed it to allow increased density, perhaps with notice, but no real appeal process, no public hearing process, and leaving the neighbors who have covenants, the only thing they can do is to use the court system if they have a complaint. That concerns me.
I hear you completely, and yet that's how the two systems work, right? So it's not the cities
yes.
to change the code to accommodate that. That's why the covenants are private. You have to sue.
I understand that. That's not been the situation in Lawrence previously because the zoning has been single family and has been in place when the covenants were adopted. And so this is a change, not a land use change, but it is a change in our community and the way we allow our neighbors to deal with each other. And I'm very interested in finding a community in which this has worked out just fine. That's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. We have worked in communities where the community has put themselves in the business of checking covenants, and inevitably, that doesn't end as well as anybody thought it would. So I think I'm happy to check in with city attorney's office and see if there's a different approach they would want to take. But otherwise, those are two different ways of enforcing what takes place on property, and to put the city in position of saying that we're going to accommodate what's going on with covenants means that we're writing different zoning regulations for a variety of different areas in the city.
I think what I hear Commissioner Eldridge saying is not that she's thinking that there needs to be enforcement by the city of covenants and vice versa, but instead she's curious, in other communities where this change has it increased litigation or conflict between neighborhoods? I think that's what so it's not so much as like, how do we change our code to enforce it,
Right.
as much as this policy change we're making, how does it work in neighborhoods outside of the code? Just what does it do to neighborhoods?
Yeah,
I
and I'm sorry
think
if it doesn't
that's.
sound like I'm
think that's-
sharing our experiences. I appreciate what the two of you are asking. That's usually a path we just don't walk down because it's not for the code to solve.
And all you could do would be to say inside the code that if covenants exist, the city will model whatever those covenants are, but I'm not sure I would be supportive of that.
I don't hear her ask. Jane, explain it. I might be wrong.
There's a nuance I'm missing.
Right, I think so. I don't hear her saying she wants any the code to address the issue. I think the concern is, are there policies or provisions in the new code that may create something we're not necessarily wanting to create, and that could be conflict between neighborhoods, is what I hear her asking. So it's more of a policy question.
Right.
This policy change that we're making, what has happened in other communities that have made this policy change.
Yeah.
Not that it's a good or a bad policy change,
Yeah.
but just what has happened. That's what I hear, but Jane, am I understanding
You're
that?
right.
Okay, thank you
You're
both.
right.
Yeah.
Sorry. And we are at 9:01, so we can maybe talk about this a little bit later. And I'm sorry we can't take public comment, but we'll be happy to stay and talk with you afterwards, or at least I will. Commissioner Rexroad, you had indicated that you had one topic. Can we handle that outside of the
Yep,
meeting?
later.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you for being here. Very much appreciate it.
Great meeting.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for the input.
Thank you.
Do we need to adjourn or anything?
You tell me what works for you for the walk.